Hello everyone and welcome to another Giant Slayer TFT How to Play video. Today our analysts will be diving into how to play Sivir carry for patch 11.7. Sivir came up in the meta a few patches ago and solidified herself as a proper sharpshooter carry, one that we were missing after the removal of Jhin. She's one of the strongest 3-cost units with a lot of flexibility in whichever compositions you play her in. We'll cover those variations as well as items and an overview for each stage of the game. With all that said, let's go ahead and dive on in. But before we begin, please don't forget to click the links in our description. Give your support to everyone who helped make this video happen. We host many TFT tournaments with plenty of exciting content to come, so be sure to also follow our Giant Slayer TFT social media pages. Alright, let's get back to the video. As per usual, we'll be starting off by covering the core items for Sivir carry compositions. To no one's surprise, the primary carry for Sivir is, well, Sivir. Whether that's playing a cultist variation or a spear sharpshooter, Sivir is the carry you want to prioritize items for. There's some pivots we can cover in a bit, but for now, let's focus on what you want for Sivir. Overall, you can choose quite a variety of items for Sivir as there's no specific items that she needs to do well. Considering that she's auto-attack focused, you'll want items that augment that aspect. The best and most common choice is going to be Last Whisper, as it helps Sivir chew through targets with a lot of armor. Infinity Edge does make a lot of sense to pair with Last Whisper, but it's not necessary. Instead, you can go for more utility-focused items like Rapid Fire Cannon or Quicksilver. Keep in mind that when Sivir uses her ability, she gains attack speed and attack damage. This helps a lot when it comes to items because she's not reliant on attack damage boosters like Deathblade or attack speed increasing items like Rageblade. You can go for them, but they're not necessary, which makes Sivir quite flexible in what items she can use. Next, we want to identify a secondary carry. The two main variations we'll be covering today are Cultist and Spear Sharpshooter. For Cultist, you can itemize Callista or Samira as your secondary damage dealer. Both of them can be used as the primary carry if you're unable to hit Sivir 3. Callista loves attack speed items like Rageblade and Runins, while Samira does well with most attack damage items like Deathblade, Last Whisper, and Infinity Edge. In Spirit Sharpshooter, you really don't have a secondary carry, though you can certainly use Tristana or later on, Samira. Instead, you generally look for items that augment Sivir or help protect your backline. Items like Zeke's Chalice or Locket. Locket in particular is great since Spirit Sharpshooter run a lot of squishy backliners. And then for both variations, there's defensive items for your frontline. Sunfire Cape early game is strong for Cultist, but weaker for Spirit Sharpshooter. Guardian Angel is always a solid option to keep your frontline alive longer, which usually is Aatrox for Cultist, or something like Sejuani or Shen for Spirit Sharpshooter. Overall, you don't really have to worry too much about specific items for your frontline, just whatever you happen to hit in the mid and late game. With items covered, let's move on to the core champions and traits for Sivir carry. The most important champion is going to be, you guessed it, Sivir. Sivir is the primary carry and your overall win condition, as the end goal is to have Sivir 3. Sivir 2 can do alright in the late game, but she will get outscaled, so you always want to keep in mind that your game plan is going to revolve around rerolling for Sivir 3 at some point. As mentioned, there's two common variations that Sivir is used as the carry in. Spear Sharpshooter is a squishy composition that does a ton of damage. It does struggle late game because it lacks a strong frontline, but overall it does well in placing in the top 4. It also has decent pivots with either Tristana 3 or later on Samira 2. The other variation is Cultist, which can be either 6 or 9. 9 Cultist tends to be a high roll variant because you need a chosen Cultist, Zillion, and ideally level 9 to fit in Sharpshooter for Sivir. 6 on the other hand is great for transitioning out of, or you can stick with it if you're able to hit Sivir 3. Both Cultist and Sivir Sharpshooter are all about the mid-game power spikes, which is where Sivir shines most as a carry. At level 8, the most common board for Sivir Sharpshooter is Sivir, Teemo, Kindred, Diana, Yuumi, and any of Tristana, Nidalee, or Samira. This can change depending on your chosen, as you'll obviously need another sharpshooter if you have a spirit chosen. In the case of spirit chosen, you'll generally drop Diana. For the rest of your board, you need a front line, which can be either vanguards like Sejuani and Aatrox, or adept units with Shen and Yone or Aurelia. Keep in mind that this comp does struggle with having a good front line, so anything that you can add to augment that is good, such as Target Dummy or even Azir for his Sand Guards. Your Cultist board is much more flexible due to the amount of Cultist units there are in the pool. Of course, if you're running 9 Cultists, you'll want all of them, with your chosen also being a Cultist. Sivir is ideal in this case, but really any Cultist chosen is alright. For 6 Cultists, your board will consist of Sivir, Aatrox, Vladimir, and Pyke as the core Cultist champions. Early game, you can run Elise and Twisted Fate. Mid to late game, you can add in Callista and Zillion. What's nice about running the 6 cultist variation is you have a lot of flexibility with what you can run with it. Adding Sharpshooter for Sivir is ideal, but besides that, you could really toss in whatever you need. Need more frontline? Add in Sejuani or Ornn. Siphoner is great, so Swain is an easy choice to pair with Vlad. Another path you can go down is Keeper with 6 cultists, either 2 or 4. Either way, you want to use Kennen as a pseudo carry / frontliner. In this variant, you can also look to 3-star Kennen along with your Sivir. One last thing to note before we move on is that you can either pivot towards Kalista 3 as your carry or Samira 2. Kalista can still use Cultist, but you'll want to add in Duelist for her. Samira can pivot to an entirely different composition centered around Slayer, with Sivir as the backup damage while also providing Sharpshooter. The Samira pivot is great for Cultists because they generally spike really hard in the mid game, which can often lead to an easier level 9, meaning that you can hit Samira 2 with greater ease than rolling on 8. With items, champions, and traits covered, let's move on to talking about each stage of the game, beginning with the early game. One of the strengths that Sivir has is the early game. Not so much because of Sivir specifically, though she is good if you can find her early, but more so due to the early game boards you can run that transition into Sivir. Both Cultist and Sharpshooter do really well in the early game. Cultist with Keeper is one of the best openers you can get, while Tristana is the strongest one cost in the game. Of course, the goal should still be to play your strongest board, but it makes for a far smoother transition if you're opening as either Cultist or Sharpshooter with Tristana or Nidalee. If you do end up with an early Tristana and continue to find her in your shop, you can also pivot towards Tristana 3 with Spirit Sharpshooter. Doing this means you won't be leveling, so you want to decide if it's worth pursuing by 2-5. The reason for that is you still want to level at standard times if you're not planning to reroll. Level 4 is at either 2-1 or 2-2, and level 5 can be pre-leveled at the end of 2-3 or normally on 2-5. If Tristana 3 is something that you want to go for, you can always wait to level until after Krugs, but keep in mind doing so foregoes a lot of the power you gain from these early game focused boards. The strength of Sivir is definitely in the mid game, so let's move on to talking about that now. Sivir absolutely shines the brightest once the mid game rolls around at level 6 on either 3-2 or 3-3. This is because the power spike of both Cultist and Spirit Sharpshooter is the strongest during stage 3 and 4. Depending on how your early game went, you'll likely already have a path figured out, but if not, you can decide once you roll on level 6. And you will roll unless you had an extremely high roll early game or you pivoted towards re-rolling for Tristana 3. Rolling on 6 does 2 things. 1, it solidifies whichever variation you're playing, and 2, you should be able to find at least one Sivir, if not a Sivir 2. Keep in mind that when rolling, your goal is not to spend all of your money, just enough to hit a power spike. For Cultist, the spike is 6 Cultists, ideally with Sivir as your carry, though Kalista is fine if not. For Spirit Sharpshooter, you want to hit 4 Spirit and 4 Sharpshooter, which requires a Chosen. 6 Cultist is really strong because most boards during stage 3 and 4 will struggle to deal with Galio, which also gives time for Sivir to dish out a bunch of damage. Spirit Sharpshooter does well because it does a lot of damage even though it lacks a frontline. Since it does lack a frontline, it helps to have 1 or 2 lockets. Yumi can also be used in the front line to help proc her ability sooner. Whichever variation you went, the next step is the same. Continue to level 7, which will be at 4-1, and roll for necessary upgrades. Sivir 2 is the goal here and absolutely necessary to do well in stage 4. The other important part is hitting a solid front line, which is usually Aatrox or Keepers for Cultist in Vanguard or Shen for Spirit Sharpshooter. Ideally, you won't roll a lot at level 7 because both compositions spike heavily during stage 3 and have strong early games. This means your health should be relatively high, which allows you to play greedier. Playing greedy means you can stay on 50 gold longer than other players and slow roll to 8, though the goal should still be to level to 8 no later than 5-3. And now for the late game. The late game for Sivir is where she struggles the most, though it is alleviated by how quickly you can find a Sivir 3. But before we get to that point, let's talk about your goals at level 8. Level 8 will happen early into stage 5 between 5-1 and 5-3. Since you should already have hit Sivir 2 at level 7, the plan here is to mostly roll for necessary upgrades. Frontline is the most important at this point, so prioritize that if possible. It's also a good time to look for 5-cost champions. Finding Zilean at level 8 is ideal for Cultist because you can run 9 Cultists assuming you have a Cultist chosen. If not, he's still one of the strongest champions you can add in for the comp. Spirit Sharpshooter doesn't gain a whole lot at level 8, so you can instead stick on 7 to roll for Sivir 3. But keep in mind, you're going to lack a frontline if you don't go to level 8, so leveling is still advised. This is also the point in the game where you want to begin rolling for Sivir 3 alongside finishing any necessary upgrades. The quicker you hit Sivir 3, the better, as both Cultist and Spirit Sharpshooter get outscaled rather fast once the majority of the lobby is going to level 8. And that's really all there is for the late game of Sivir. Transition if needed, but the win condition is Sivir 3. Once you hit Sivir 3, you can begin leveling to 9, but without Sivir 3, you're going to struggle. As mentioned earlier, if you can't find Sivir 3, then Samira is the best pivot, or in the case of Cultists, you can look for Callista 3. But Samira is ideal as she's one of the best 5-cost carries in the game and synergizes well with the compositions you'll be running already. The other aspect of the late game is positioning, which is all about keeping your Sivir safe. With Cultists, this tends to be easy as you're going to be clumped up, so keep your Sivir surrounded. Spirit Sharpshooter will have a harder time protecting Sivir, but as long as you keep her away from obvious threats like assassins or Aatrox, you should be fine. Just keep in mind you always want your frontline on the same side as your Sivir, especially if they have crowd control like Sejuani. And that's going to be it for today's video, folks. When set 4.5 came out, it looked like Sharpshooters were going to struggle without a proper carry after Jhin had been removed. Thanks to Sivir and Tristana, we've arrived in a meta where Sharpshooters are once again viable, which is great to see. Let us know in the comment section below if there's any compositions you'd like us to cover in future How to Play videos. Thank you for watching, and if you're enjoying our content, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe for future Giant Slayer TFT videos.